I would like to welcome all of our visitors, as well as all the students who are dutifully here because we'll lower your GPA if you don't come. That's sort of a joke. At least the faculty's laughing. All right. And, what I want to say to the visitors is this, and for those of you who are at dinner, you've already heard this. We're really glad that you're here. We do events like this about once a month, so you will get to meet a wide range of artists who are working across the country, and you'll get to talk to them and ask them questions about their work and how they got to where they are and all those good sorts of things. And then following the talk, there will be a reception in the gallery. We'll feed you a little bit of pizza, and when that's done, you're going to come back for an event called SARS, in which every art major gets 60 seconds to talk about what they did this year, including the faculty. And what we hope you get out of this is a sense of, kind of what our department is like, the kind of camaraderie, the fact that you get to meet real artists, both the people we bring in from outside as well as the professionally active artists who teach here. And tomorrow we'll take you downtown and show you our connection to the city of Chicago. Thanks for coming. And Josh, our gallery director, is up next.
Hi everyone, welcome high school students. We're excited to have you all here. One note that the art you see on the walls out here in the hallway is by two of our students, Naomi and Kristen, and there will be a also opening reception sort of event for them after SARS. So stick around and talk to them. I think they do a talk too, right? Or they'll talk about the work and what they're thinking about. Also, there is a student design organization meeting Thursday the 18th at 4 p.m. Ellen, do you want to say anything further about that to get people riled up? Great, thanks. And I'm super pleased to introduce two of the artists of 5 altogether that are participating in the show in the Searveld Gallery. We have Ryan Griffiths and Sarah Kanouse. Ryan hails from the Sunshine State of Florida, and he is a teacher of new media at the University of Illinois, which is where I went to grad school. And I also met Sarah during grad school, and she's currently teaching at University of Iowa in the intermedia program, and she'll probably maybe mention a little bit of what that's about because it has something to do with what we're looking at in the gallery today. So please give them a hand, and thank you so much, guys, for being here.
Can everybody hear me? Is this mic kind of on, or do I just need to scream? Oh, they're turning right now. Okay. Working?
Maybe shove them a little bit closer, too.
You can listen to the mic. Is this better? Better?
You're whispering.
Maybe?
That sounds better.
Does it sound okay?
Sounds hot.
From here I can tell. This is a performance piece.
Is this one on? Oh yeah. Here, let's trade.
Hello. Yeah, wow, that's definitely on. Yeah, so we owe a big thanks to Josh Hipple, who's done a lot of work on this exhibition that we're going to talk about the content for. Made a lot of things happen, so we're really grateful to him for facilitating all kinds of aspects of the show, and also to others at Trinity who welcomed us here. Yeah, thank you. So my name is Ryan, as Josh said, and what I'm going to talk about tonight, what we're going to talk about tonight, is one particular project that is a part of a more ongoing long-term project that's called the Temporary Travel Office, which is a fictional yet operational travel agency that produces a variety of tourist experiences, some of which we're going to talk about tonight, and sometimes serves as an unsolicited consultant for clients such as the National Park Service. So this particular presentation is going to introduce the first in a series of tour guidebooks. The exhibition is sort of the first kind of exhibition-like representation of the book. It's actually a book project that you'll see a little bit more about. So as I said, it's the first in a series, and the series is titled Stories in Reserve, which is also the title of the exhibition. So when you think of guidebooks, tourist guidebooks, you probably think of publications like the Lonely Planet series. Lonely Planet probably has a guidebook for every nation and region that has a beach, a mountain, an ancient city, large mammals, or cool footwear. But what they mostly do is to create destinations based on contained geographies that can be marked by easily identifiable cultural signifiers, as the covers of their publications attest to. The boundaries of the book coincide with their simplified depiction of national and regional borders. This is an image from a website, maptown.com, which is one of the many, probably millions of bookstores that sell Lonely Planet guides. This is a map interface that they created for users to click on and then purchase Lonely Planet guides, obviously based on the region that are contained by these rectangles. But I think there's something to how this map is organized and how these lines are drawn that say something about the kind of experience that's expected out of a Lonely Planet guide, right? There are these sort of particular demarcations of where the experience starts and where it stops. So Lonely Planet guides are designed to result in moments like this, or maybe like this. Generally not like this. This is the kind of landscape that we're more interested in. When I say we, I mean the Temporary Travel Office. But in this presentation, we're not wholly trying to discount the potential of guidebooks either. Obviously, we have produced a guidebook of sorts. There's an often noted philosopher and anthropologist of urban space and what we might call the everyday, right? The kind of everyday experiences of life, named Michel Desserteau. And Desserteau uses the idea of what he calls spatial practices to describe those activities that can be resistant and elusive of discipline without being outside of the field in which that discipline is exercised. So for us, the field of activity that we're interested in looking at where these spatial practices occur in one realm is tourism itself. Another central idea that we might think about is put forward by another sort of anthropologist of space in the everyday, but more in the form of leisure and what we might think of as free time. And he uses this phrase, liminal leisure, meaning that there's something about how we activate free time and how we use free time and what we do in our leisure time that sometimes allows us to become more aware of norms and where the boundaries of those norms are, right? Like what kind of behaviors are expected in a certain place and how we habitually perform those expectations without necessarily being aware of it. And this kind of leads us to what some of the potential of guidebooks are. And in one way, we see them as a form of speculative mapping. By speculative, I mean this idea of projecting forward into a time and space that's not yet experienced by a user. Right? This is in many ways what guidebooks do. We get them because we haven't had the experience that the guidebook promises to us yet, right? So one of our goals is to create a tour guide that can function both as a critique of tourist publications and the expectations of books like Lonely Planet guides, but also function as a guidebook, something that can actually be used in a particular way. So going back to Desserteau, he's also written of tourism, and I'm quoting him now, and he says, "What does travel ultimately produce if it is not the return to nearby exoticism by way of a detour through distant places?" And possibly typical of somebody like Desserteau, there's a lot of kind of tangled verbiage that's in there. But But what he's basically saying is that there's something about the desire that we have to go to exotic places that allows us to have a different relationship to where we come from. And so we're very interested in this idea, but we're more interested in getting back to the nearby without having to go far away. So how can we sort of interrogate the spaces that are already around us or maybe aren't perceived as exotic and still learn something about ourselves? And maybe even think about how the nearby already and always contains a far away literally within it. That what we think of as nearby is possibly more complicated. So in producing tourist experiences, it's very important for us to acknowledge critics of ideas like preservationism. Preservationism is maybe a word that we've heard a lot, but maybe don't think a lot about what it means. But we might think about it in terms of environmental preservation, right? So there are critics of this idea of preservationism that look at how the dominant ideas of preservation are based on architectural and natural aesthetics of permanence and integrity or purity. So these critics point to the loss, for example, the loss of sites of significance to the African diaspora in North America due to a perceived lack of artifacts of material value. So there's not a whole lot of things, for example, you can point to like the house where Lincoln grew up in that gets preserved for all sorts of reasons related to historical integrity and so on. The exclusion of spiritual and utilitarian, and these are my scare quotes for those of you that can't see in the back, utilitarian practices by indigenous communities such as fishing or farming in the name of wilderness is also a critique of such ideas of preservationism. But there are also useful ways, at least to us, that tourism both facilitates and challenges dominant preservation practices, like those just mentioned, by employing forms of what could be called site sacralization. This idea of sort of literally the process of making a location sacred by performing rituals in previously unritualized spaces. So spaces that aren't already deemed as sacred can become sacred through the performing of rituals in them. And then we sort of perform and create a different relationship, not just between ourselves in the space, but between others in that space who visit it later. Such rituals are based on a revealing of something that was inaccessible or invisible, what might be thought of as the ghosts or spirits of a place. Like well, you can't really see it, so you'll have to take my word for it. Oh, that's right, we forgot to turn the lights off. Well,
Better a little bit?
it's a little better. You can see the sign a little better. Should we turn the other one off? Yeah. You still may have to take my word for it. Okay, so there's a historical sign here, and it talks about a series of demonstrations, civil rights demonstrations that happened in the 1960s in downtown Jacksonville, Florida, which is where I'm from. So it's kind of a typical historical marker. Maybe even from the shape you've seen kind of markers that look very similar in other places. Such spirits might also be hidden toxic substances or the legal, technical, and social desires that put fiber optic cable on the ground here. So this is a warning sign that says, warning, there's fiber optic cable under the ground here in case, you decided you were just going to grab a shovel and start digging in some random place. Don't do it here. Or looking at another sign that happens to be right next to that fiber optic cable warning sign, the spirit of a particular person or event, such as Johnny Mae Chappelle, who was a black woman murdered in 1964 by angry whites who were violently resisting the efforts of the civil rights movement happening in Florida at that time. So these ideas that I'm talking about are not so much an appeal to the idea of seeing things anew that's often seen as a function of art. A lot of times people talk about one thing that art can do is find the interesting in the banal or the bland or the otherwise uninteresting and somehow make us interested in something that really isn't that interesting. That's not exactly what we're talking about. And it's a little bit difficult to explain how it's not, because even to myself, a lot of it actually sounds like that what I may be doing. So hopefully some of the things that we'll talk about related to this book will provide a difference, something that we can compare that idea against. So Disserto's assertion that people can only live in Haunted Places foregrounds the social nature of geography. He makes that more clear by saying that the spirits haunting a place can be invoked or not, but they do not speak any more than they see. So it's up to a social practice, it's how we inhabit the landscape to give these spirits a voice again, or not. This is done officially through authoritative signage, national state parks, monuments, history books, and less officially in things like oral histories, personal photographs, and anecdotes that we might tell others, and amateur and fan-based publications. The title of our guidebook series comes from a passage in Disserteau's often quoted book. If any people haven't read Disserteau, but they've read one thing, it's probably this book called The Practice of Everyday Life. And our title comes from one passage in a chapter called Walking in the City, which is what's reproduced on this slide. And maybe I'll just read that for people in the back who can't see it. Places are fragmentary and inward-turning histories, past that others are not allowed to read, accumulated times that can be unfolded, but like stories held in reserve, remaining in an enigmatic state. So we understand his use of the word enigmatic here to mean something other than inaccessible or vague. In other words, we don't think he means inaccessible or vague when he uses the word enigmatic, which is sometimes how the word gets used, especially in sort of everyday art discourse. Sometimes we'll say something is enigmatic because we can't explain what's going on there, and therefore we choose to just leave it vague or let it stay in this unexplained state. And so I don't think that that's exactly what he means there. I think he means something more like contentious or heterogeneous, or something that is up for debate, that there may be more than one way of understanding what's going on, and not to say it's a relativistic position that any of those ways are equally valuable, but that it's something to struggle over. And so the definition that wins out because somehow it dominated over the other positions, not because it was necessarily the right one. So this idea is what's particularly interesting to us, and why we decided to produce this series of guidebooks. We wanted to think about how to produce some small mechanism that would facilitate a social practice in the form of tourism that would bring to life a certain set of spirits that we wanted to give voice to. So in contrast to the Lonely Planet guides, we want to position tourist readers in between what we might think of as the elsewhere, right, the far away, and the right here, the place that we happen to inhabit or inhabit regularly, or at least think we inhabit regularly, rather than trying to find either commonality or difference in other cultures and other geographies. And maybe even finding that most of us already occupy disparate and conflicting cultures, that's something that's already part of who we are, and that the distance between geographies can't always be understood through units of measurement. It's not always about what we think of as geographical or geological distance. So for the first volume of these guidebooks, we decided to focus on a territory that we think of as close to home, and I don't mean we in terms I'm not projecting onto you, but we, the Temporary Travel Office, and that's the continent of North America. The Lonely Planet version might look something like this, discrete volumes that organize experience along political and national borders and illustrated by popular cultural tropes and landmarks, right? There's something about the images on the covers and the use of the name of the country, for example, that already kind of sets up certain expectations that we might already carry, but then they reinforce them. Of course, North America is also a geography where mobility across borders isn't as smooth as picking up a guidebook and hopping on a plane, boat, train, bus, car. Just as there are national conflicts over borders, there are also conflicts over how to relax those borders and for whom. So we wanted to work within this troubled continental geography while also destabilizing it, trying to produce a tourist experience that reveals how borders can be experienced at different scales, from the neighborhood to the city to the nation. Specifically rooted stories seemed a necessary way of trying to do this. So we began by commissioning 3 tours that span different terrain and narratives. Each tour is represented as an audio guide that's accompanied by images, maps, and an introductory text. And the little image in the bottom right, which is a photograph by Charlie Roderick, who's sitting over there by Josh, who let us use his image gratefully. And then it contains 3 CDs that contain the audio tours. So Sarah Kanouse, who's here to my left, your right, is here to discuss the first of the 3 tours, America Ponds, which takes listeners through a wildlife refuge in southern Illinois. Lizzie Mogul, Sarah Ross, and myself produced Sighting Exposition's walking tour of Vancouver's False Creek, a centrally located urban waterway in the city of Vancouver. So it's pretty much located in what you might think of as the heart of Vancouver in British Columbia. The tour looks at this waterfront because its urban character has largely been shaped over the last 30 years, from a working industrial waterway to a mostly expensive luxury residential waterfront. Its developers have even referred to it as Vancouver's last waterfront community, which has an oddly kind of sinister sound to it. But the following clip, the next slide will have an audio clip that accompanies it, discusses the largest developer in Vancouver and one of the largest in the world, which is a company based out of Hong Kong called Concord Pacific, which developed the north side of False Creek following Expo 86, which is a world fair that happened obviously in 1986 in Vancouver.
In front of you is the Concord Pacific sales office. Inside is a large model of the city of Vancouver, highlighting Concord's development projects. Go inside and look at the model. If you cannot get inside, walk around to the waterfront side of the building and view the model through the large picture window. There are many ways to view a place, and many ways that views create place. Mega events temporarily transform the identity of cities as they move from place to place. There are temporary laws enacted, temporary provisions for businesses, temporary fees and taxes, temporary street closures, temporary spaces made.
The Olympics themselves reconfigure city spaces everywhere they go. They require financial investments and personnel only rivaled by military operations. Expo 86 was like a small town with streets, buildings, transportation, and shops that existed for only 6 months before almost completely disappearing. Spaces around these mega events are designed to create an idealized model of a multicultural world unhindered by national boundaries. A new set of borders are erected to define this new consumer paradise. These borders require heightened security to defend and maintain this so-called utopia, making the temporary city more like a gated community. Increased security creates exceptional conditions for the use of force and new surveillance tools. However you look at it, it is not difficult to see how a mega event becomes an exception to the perceived rule.
What is often difficult to see is how these temporary cities make way for a more permanent, new city. There are many ways to view a place, and many ways that views create a place. This model is one. Surveillance cameras are another. As you view this model, imagine yourself as a surveyor, planning the future movements of residents as they navigate your city. Now imagine yourself as a tiny person walking through the model as planners, politicians, and developers observe you. There are multiple ways that your presence here is inserted into a picture of this place. In your movements, you may have been seen by others as a tourist, a customer, a local, or a threat. What larger stories are you a part of here?
So the third tour that's part of the book is by an artist named Ricardo Miranda Zuniga, and he's contributed an abbreviated form of a much larger project that looks at the role dental care plays in the transnational economy between Mexico and the United States. For Volume 1, we worked with Ricardo to produce a walking tour of the Zona Centro area of Tijuana in Mexico, which is a part of the city dense with dental care providers. So as you walk this particular route, you're likely to see a lot of signs like the ones that are pictured here. Ricardo found that the border is enacted not just along national boundaries and in the form of checkpoints, border guards, walls, and passports. It also exists through the needs of residents whose lives happen to fall on one side or another of the borders. Borders also materialize through people defining the limits of their own needs and rights, and especially in how they understand the borders of their own bodies, or in this case, their mouths. In the following audio clip, Ricardo talks with a dentist about the role of U.S. insurance companies in Mexican dentistry near the border, and ends with a song that he wrote that celebrates dentists as players in the border economy.
La revisión tiene un costo. Todo tiene costo en Estados Unidos. Aquí las personas que vienen es porque evidentemente el precio es menor y la calidad viene siendo igual.
As Dr. Morales puts it, the great business of the United States are the insurance companies. Those insurance companies charge for an indefinite amount of time so that every moment is charged. People come from the United States accustomed to being charged for everything. After all, in the US, time is money. After several weeks of traveling the border and a few weeks staying in Tijuana and speaking with dozens of Mexican dentists, I decided to write a song dedicated to the border dentist in the form of a corrido, a traditional celebratory type of song established during the Mexican Revolution to celebrate the heroes of the revolution. Alejandro Espino Aldana performed Corrido al Dentista.
Soy dentista en la frontera, me he encampado, buscando el dólar americano. Recibo al yanqui con su muela bien podrida, sin ningún seguro y su boca sangrando. Soy poblano y estudié odontología en la UNAM para ejercer aquí en Tijuana. Soy dentista mexicano y con orgullo, limpiando boca de todo americano. Jim le dijo a Marianne, quien le dijo a su hermano Bob, y Bob le dijo a su vecina Beth, quien se llevó a su esposo John.
So that's not the whole song, obviously, just a few of the verses. So I'm now going to turn it over to Sarah.
So Ryan was giving you a little bit of an overview of the whole Stories in Reserve series and then two of the other projects. And I'm going to focus just on my project, which is called America Ponds. And the first thing that I sort of want to say is that, sort of to be very broadly reductive about it, there are a lot of different ways of being an artist, but I think you can kind of maybe break things into two broad categories, that there are artists who are interested in making work that is primarily an aesthetic experience. It's something that transports you aesthetically and makes you see the world anew, and that relates to a kind of history of artistic practice in that vein that goes back hundreds of years. And then there's another group of artists who are really interested in art as a tool of creative inquiry into things that are out there in the world and trying to understand our place in relationship to other people, to current events, to historical events, to institutions, to society at large. And I think that all of the artists who are represented in this book and in the exhibition sort of generally ally ourselves with that, where sort of the aesthetic component of our work is a sort of choice in order to further an analysis and a way of talking about things that are sort of out there in the world that aren't necessarily in the piece. So keep that in the back of your mind as I'm talking about this, because for me, my artistic practice is very much about trying to understand the world around me and my place in it. The genesis of this particular project came from when I moved from Chicago to Southern Illinois to take my first, real academic job at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. Oops. I'll talk. I forgot that was attached to that. I went there, and I found that this was this very, very unfamiliar environment. I had grown up in Los Angeles. I'd gone to I lived on the East Coast for college. I had gone to graduate school at University of Illinois with Josh, moved to Chicago, and I had never been in a truly rural environment. And working on this project was part of a range of things that I did there to try to make sense of this place for me. So I'm going to start out by playing the introduction to the tour, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the content and the space the tour is about, and then some of the aesthetic strategies that I employed.
No matter how you get there, the road to Crab Orchard National Wildlife Refuge is unexceptional. Along Illinois Route 13, billboards for discount LASIK surgery, car dealerships, urologists, and community colleges sprout from the flat rural landscape. It's one long strip mall between the interstate and the refuge. The buildings are farther apart and have bigger lawns than they would in the suburbs, but they're more or less the same. A few brown signs are all that show that you're coming close to one of the Fish and Wildlife Service's most unique sites. Looking at a map, Crab Orchard is just another place to hunt, fish, hike, and camp in southern Illinois. The area has a lot of protected forest and is surprisingly rugged considering the pancake reputation of the rest of the state. South of Route 13, the land falls away. The plateau carved by the last glaciers gives way to the boulder-sized rubble left behind when the ice sheets melted. Southern Illinois is spiritually and geographically closer to the Ozark Mountains of Missouri, Arkansas, than it is to Chicago. The climate is pretty mild, and people come here to do outdoor sports, especially fishing, year-round. Between the Shawnee National Forest and various other protected lands, Crab Orchard is, to many, just another place to get a weekend nature fix. But maps don't tell the whole story. Turns out, they don't tell much of it at all. Crab Orchard is exceptional, not just in southern Illinois, but throughout the country. It was founded in a unique way, for unique purposes, and as a result, it uniquely tries to balance different missions that seem, on the surface, completely incompatible. You see, Crab Orchard has the distinction of being the only site in the entire National Wildlife Refuge system that, in addition to conservation, operates recreation facilities, rents land for farming and grazing, and leases space to industrial tenants. The primary tenant is the military contractor, General Dynamics, which rents far-flung warehouses to manufacture munitions for the U.S. Army. If this seems like a strange thing to do in a wildlife refuge, maybe it is. But how this came to be and what it might mean is one subject of this audience.
Okay. So as I was saying before, my art practice is a way of trying to understand where I am in the world and the world around me. And when I moved to Southern Illinois, it was this rural place, extremely far away from Chicago, and it felt very, very, very far away from any place where decisions were made, right? It felt like this place where people were just kind of struggling to get by. It's economically very depressed. There aren't a lot of large kind of social educational institutions. There's one big university. And yet I know, that no place is outside of these kinds of institutions. And I was interested in seeing how Southern Illinois was actually kind of produced as part of the way that society functions, that it wasn't just kind of this afterthought. So this is an aerial image of one of Crab Orchard's lakes, and this is a map. You kind of can't miss Crab Orchard as you're driving through or coming into Carbondale, which is where the university that I worked was. That road on the top where it says to Carbondale, that is Illinois 13, and you actually drive directly over the lake. It's a beautiful place to go and take hikes, to bring your dog, all things that I enjoyed doing a lot. But doing that also meant that you would pass places like this. This is without giving it away, it's a bunch of white metal kind of pole barns, fairly dilapidated, surrounded by barbed wire. Weeds over the summer will progressively grow bigger and bigger and bigger until somebody comes by and mows them, and then they'll get bigger and bigger and bigger again. These are scattered all over the place without comment. There are 6 or 7 of these. Sort of began to get curious about this place. There's also this beautiful lake, actually 3 beautiful lakes, but at every boat launch there are signs warning you against eating some of the fish. So I kept getting more curious about this. Then, in addition to those shuttered white buildings, there are active industrial sites like this one, which also made me very curious. And adjacent to the refuge is a large federal prison. So, going home, Google's this great thing. You can start Googling this stuff, and you find out that, in fact, that beautiful lake is a Superfund site, which is a designated environmental disaster that the EPA is supervising the cleanup of, so that it will no longer be a threat to human health and the environment. That the industrial facilities that are shuttered and closed were part of a World War II era ammunition factory that was there, was converted to non-military purposes after the war, but they kind of couldn't find any non-military purposes for it, and so today a multi-billion-dollar military contractor, General Dynamics, kind of took over and manufactures ammunition for the Army there. And that this prison was taken out of part of the former ordnance plant and converted to the nation's first ultra-high security prison, which had been for about 20 years under permanent lockdown. So people were kept in their cells 23 hours a day, 7 days a week. They had no human beings touch them for as many as 10, 15, 20 years. It was the target of an international human rights campaign. Looking a little bit more generally into Southern Illinois, you find out about things like this, which is that many of the communities, small communities in the area, were completely segregated, that there would be towns that literally did not allow African American people to be in them after the sun set. They were called sundown towns. Often, a few miles away, there would be a town that was completely African American only. And you also learn about things like this, that there was for many years a very strong militant labor unions which organized the mines in Southern Illinois, which had been a strong coal mining region. And they were extremely powerful. There had been a very high standard of living for the miners for quite some time. But that following the introduction of the Clean Air Act, a lot of those mines closed, and that was where at least some of the economic problems of the area in the present moment kind of came from. So I became interested in how Crab Orchard was kind of situated at the center of all of these things that were happening right around its edges. And I was curious about how they were related. But it was kind of like an idle level of curiosity until some friends were traveling through the area, and I decided to show them this place and talk about it, say that I think this is an interesting place. So they were shooting some video on the road in the refuge, and we were stopped by security, and they said, please, don't shoot video here. It was video of some of those white industrial buildings, And we said, okay. And they took down our license plate number and we went on the way. And then 4 days later, 2 FBI agents from the Joint Terrorism Task Force came to my house and wanted to know why we were taking pictures. Now, that's somewhat alarming, but it also says that, something kind of significant is going on in this place, and that signs like this, which are in Crab Orchard, maybe aren't telling the whole story, that the harmonious mix of uses where industry, agriculture, recreation, and conservation are supposed to be there operating in harmony at all time, that maybe isn't the whole story. That sort of brush with the FBI turned it from being this sort of curiosity into being this thing that I really wanted to explore further. One of the things that my research one of the directions that it's going now, I'm working on turning this kind of audio tour into a film. And I thought about the audio tour as a kind of a place-based audio documentary. So as you listen to it, you're getting a lot of information about the landscape, but it's not structured as a conventional documentary because you get that information according to where you are, right, theoretically. But one piece that's becoming a bigger part of the subsequent video film piece that I'm making is how Crab Orchard is sort of like a harbinger of a strategy of land management to come. So Crab Orchard was converted from being this ordnance plant into being a wildlife refuge after World War II in the 1940s. And it's the only wildlife refuge that has this multiple mission where it has to always be used for industry, recreation, farming, and conservation because of a political deal that was cut. That's how a lot of things happen. But in the 1980s and in the 1990s, a lot of military bases closed because it was after the Cold War was over, and there were loads and loads of arsenals, uranium enrichment facilities that were no longer needed. And so they started closing them. And these places are heavily, heavily contaminated. For 50 years, they were building nuclear weapons in some of these places. And that's not a very clean thing to do. And it presented a problem. So we close this place, what are we going to do with it? Well, many of these places are very remote. They didn't let anyone on them because they were, top secret military installations. And so there were lots of wildlife. I know, let's turn it into a wildlife refuge, because if it isn't going to be used for anything else, like if it's not going to be a commercial space or a residential space, we don't actually have to clean it up. And so over the last 25 years, about 20 of these former military installations have been converted to wildlife refuge, and Crab Orchard is sort of like the emblematic one of these. What interests me about this is that, well, it's just interesting, but it also tells us something about how people perceive nature and the kind of what we call discursive work that nature does. So by declaring a contaminated site to be a refuge, right, to say that it's natural, it makes us start believing a chain of things that nature conjures in our mind. So we think of nature as being pure. We think of it as being safe and clean and something quite nice, something that we need more of, right? By doing this thing, nature kind of cleans it up representationally so that it's no longer necessary, politically speaking, to clean it up in reality. So I'm very interested in this notion of the work that nature does. So nature basically takes places like this, which is a bomb storage igloo on Crab Orchard, and this, which is the signage that looks a lot like Park Service interpretive signage, telling you where the General Dynamics facilities are, and turns it into this. Right? So this photo is actually taken on the site of many of the unexploded bomb storage igloos. So there are unexploded weapons in that field there. And I'll play another clip.
If you turn left on Wolf Creek Road and head away from General Dynamics for a half mile, you'll pass one of the most popular spots in Crab Orchard. Depending on the time of year and the weather, You may see a line of men and waders on the shoreline, hear the hum of boats on the water, or watch children feed ducks by the landing. There's nothing to tell you that you are entering what was one of the most hazardous parts of the refuge. The former Illinois Ordnance Plant weapons storage area was on either side of Wolf Creek Road, south of the lake. And this is the place where most of the buried live munitions have been found. The Environmental Protection Agency certified that the Army has cleaned up the most significant hazards. But the roads to these sites are still blocked and do not appear on visitor maps. Most of these places have a long list of restrictions. No agriculture, no burning, no digging, no soil removal, limited mowing, no access except for necessary personnel wearing protective gear. Once per year, the refuge opens up the safest parts of these areas so family members can visit the graves of ancestors buried in cemeteries before the land was given over to building bombs. The landscape that you see from the car betrays little evidence of these hazards. Cows graze peacefully in paddocks on both sides of the road. The refuge's signature Canada geese rest in ponds that dot the area. Coyotes can sometimes be spotted loping through the fields. That's one of the ways landscapes work. They make places look like nature, invoking a string of associations that make the tables listing known contaminants seem dry, unreal, and very, very far away. It's hard to get worked up over language like thallium exceeded screening criterion 3 soil samples once you cut a glimpse of a mother fox and her cubs. But both exist, the thallium and the foxes, the cows and the PCBs. We need to be able to hold them all in our heads at once. The scientific abstraction of screening criteria, the sensual pleasure of grass-scented breezes, and the warm, fuzzy feelings we get about cute baby animals. The landscape is simultaneously what we think we know through our senses and the database full of GPS coordinates and test results. It's also the stories the scenery evokes and the stories it conceals. Maybe the trick is to look at the landscape as the Fish and Wildlife Service does, as something both very polluted and as something worth working hard to save. Of course, they also keep signing leases with General Dynamics.
So I'm going to just very quickly talk a little bit about some of the aesthetic choices that I made. I'm very interested in playing with the authority of the audio tour, since this is a totally unofficial tour and not sanctioned by the refuge in any way. I felt it really important to have a performer who could project this information with the authority of fact, because all of this is based in fact, but then also kind of tweak that a little bit and present these sort of digressions and analysis in a more conversational sort of way. It also was interesting to me to play with the kind of seamless confidence of the audio of the audio tour, while the sound was undercutting the story that the landscape was telling about itself. So these two things were in interplay with each other. The other thing that was a significant choice for me was all of the sound effects, the sort of musical elements in there, are actually the result of processing ambient sound, ambient natural sounds. So there's this kind of remediation of nature into producing a kind of electronic music effect, which was also kind of conceptually important to me. So there is not a single piece of music in there. It's just bird song and cars driving by and other things like ambience processed. I also created, there were a lot of things that I couldn't talk about or didn't want to talk about in the audio tour / audio documentary, but I hoped would sort of bubble to the surface. And so I used things called sound marks, pieces of sound that I would use over and over and over again in the track to emphasize a certain point. So for instance, there's a way that there's a sound of people walking down a boat dock that has a kind of hollow, echoey sound, and that became a sound mark for various forms of dispossession. So I use that when talking about the farmers who originally lost their land so that the ordnance plant and the lake could be built. And I use that when talking about the people who could no longer visit their families' graves because they're in this refuge. And then I use it again when talking about the prison toward the end of it. So I think that's all for our formal presentation. We can take questions. I know that we're on a tight timetable because there's stacked events happening tonight. So I thank you very much for your attentiveness. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious, people in your surrounding area, are they aware of the work? Are you sharing it with the community?
Yeah. I partly because I used to work there. I have a lot of contacts there, so I'm continuing to work. And people, any community is extremely divided, right? There's no such thing as a homogenous community. So I tend to ally myself much more with sort of the environmentalist and the peace activists. And so I've been sharing that a lot with them and send, releases and things like that out. And I've been involved in an ongoing conversation with the Fish and Wildlife Service about this body of work for about a year. And they're not terribly supportive, to say the least. But we have been in touch. Yeah.
Are you familiar with the audio walk work of Janet Carter?
Yeah.
How would you, maybe you could describe her work briefly,
Mm-hmm.
if you're familiar enough, and compare what you do, or I guess maybe the whole audio tour project with the types of observational things that she does. You mind? I'm just interested in maybe the contrast as a way of understanding better.
Yeah.
your interest.
Well, so Janet Cardiff and her partner collaborator, George Burris Miller, are often invited into a space by a cultural institution to produce a sort of site-specific audio tour where they blend people's, so participants or listeners, we're such a visual culture, it's really hard to get away from saying viewer even when you're talking about sound. Listeners will, take headphones and go on a walk and have a very immersive experience in the space where the sound will refer to things that you see on the walk that are, visual. So a particular door, a particular garden, a particular view. And then interweave narrative elements. And those narratives are often somewhat enigmatic. So you have this experience of entering into somebody else's life momentarily. The audio, as I said, is very immersive. So they use a complex kind of binaural system. So you feel that somebody may be right over your shoulder whispering into your ear. And it's this extremely, sensual and tantalizing kind of auditory experience. I would sort of identify a lot of what they do with sort of the aesthetic end of art practice. So the narratives don't resolve into being about the world out there. Like the world out there is sort of a set, for having the aesthetic experience that the audio tour provides. And it's less about coming to some sort of intellectual or political understanding of the space that you're moving through. But I think that I feel influenced by them, technically and aesthetically because the work is, phenomenally accomplished and very beautiful. Yeah.
I'm curious, what's next? When I asked them, have you shared this with the community, I guess I was also interested in the responses you're getting and where are you now that, you experienced it, you did the research, you produced, and here it is. still. So I guess we can talk about that a little bit.
When you say here it is still, what do you mean?
In some ways, you have exposed these multifaceted ironies,
Mm-hmm.
and after doing this, we are sitting with them.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, how are you sitting with them?
Well, I think one of the things that was the hardest thing to explain to the FBI is that you can not be terribly thrilled that something is going on in a particular place without trying to stop it. What I actually think Crab Orchard is a squandered opportunity to think much more critically about what nature means in an era when human beings have changed almost every inch of the planet through our activities. And if we hadn't in the past done that, which is I think a significant question. Like we see the Industrial Revolution as somehow changing everything, but people have been modifying the planet since there were people. What I hope is that this becomes an opportunity to sit and think on these complex set of interrelations and not to have a sort of knee-jerk reaction, well, oh no, that needs to stop, because these conditions are extremely complex and they're very big. And I hope that this piece does for others what it did for me, which is prompt me to have a much more critical notion of nature and to think about what it does and what it might do differently if we think about it in a different way.
Kind of thinking about something that I read recently that talked about Instituto in relationship to Web 2.0 or kind of template-based ways of interacting with the net at some level, or a lot of platforms like Facebook, for example, this idea that you feel somewhat as a user empowered, right, on some level by choices of being able to manipulate a template that's still really, if you look deeper into that or think more critically of it, it's actually still very restricted. And I'm wondering, in relationship to guides and stuff like that, what kind of tactics do you have to potentially let users feel not only that they're given some option or agency in interacting with it in a more open or empowered way, but don't also still feel that kind of restriction or have a desire to subvert or think freely or whatever, which I think might be some of your intention. Yeah, is that clear? Question? Because I feel like we're so bombarded by template-based stuff now, or guides, that it's hard to tell the difference. It's hard to look through it.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you bring up in terms of templates could potentially be a whole other kind of conversation, but maybe what I can take from that and how you're trying to use that as a way to structure a question for like tour guides as a kind of template for experience, maybe.
Yeah, or how to get viewers to participate and feel that they own that participation.
Yeah, getting participation can be a pretty difficult thing, and I think, at least for me, one way of understanding it is trying to, from the very beginning, thinking about what you're producing is already part of something that has participation. So instead of like producing something and then sort of like handing it off to people and say, here's this thing, you can now go do it, developing a thing that is already based on what the people are doing that you perceive as your audience. And it may be in a way that requires a shifting of the notion of audience into not necessarily collaborators, but a constituency of some kind, where you're part of a constituency and what you're producing already has a group of people that it's based on in those certain kinds of activities. And I think one, at least, thing that, and this somehow ties to the last question in Sarah's response, that I think is is in some ways an interesting question for me in relationship to tour guides is part of the, like the idea, for example, that a lot of the things that Sarah was talking about is perceived as an irony. I think one of the things that's particularly interesting, and I think in a lot of ways what Sarah's work, I find her doing in many ways really successful, and some of the other people that I would like to commission tours to do, is coming to terms with an idea that that possibly seeing things as ironic. So for example, seeing that there was this industrial activity on what we think of as a wildlife refuge, seeing that as ironic is in many ways like, it puts certain boundaries around things, right? That our irony comes from an understanding of these boundaries and taking those boundaries as kind of given. And so I think it could be, one thing I'm really interested in with this series is trying to somehow break those boundaries and come to terms with the fact that there's nothing ironic actually about this at all. And in some ways, perceiving it as ironic can be a boundary that enables some of the things that might be seen as less productive or less useful or less good or whatever kind of value-based language you want to use in these terms. It prevents some of those changes potentially for happening, or it prevents you from participating and changing things in a particular way. And so maybe in some ways that the template idea for me, I think, really comes down to how the boundaries are determined. And so that's the series is meant to maybe try to make those boundaries both visible and try to open up ways in which you can cross the boundaries or find space between them, or there's all kinds of spatial metaphors I could use for that, but something like that, I think.
Right now, but we should probably wrap it up. If you guys have any more questions for either Sarah or Ryan, please don't hesitate to come up to them and ask. And we have a little bit of time right now to enjoy some pizza.